All right, well, thank you all for coming to this. As we have spoken oftentimes at some of these meetings, people would have drafts of projects and that sort of thing, and indeed this is what I have, just a draft. And I don't know where it's going to appear or how, but I do know I need to make a couple of forays into Latin Averroism to correct mistakes in the Latin Averroist accounts, because often those are read back into Averroes himself. One issue I know certainly has to be dealt with, and I have dealt with it elsewhere, but I need to revisit it and publish it, is the issue of first and second Averroism. So that's a substantial, complicated methodological issue. But today I'm speaking here on, or taking you on a ride through a discussion of Averroes on the achievement of ultimate happiness. So you have an outline there, and these are all the things I hoped one day to do, but the paper itself begins with the second part. But let me talk a little bit about the introduction to this. The issue is that of ultimate happiness. This is important to all three Abrahamic traditions, and it is somehow seeing God, but there are lots of variations on that. And certainly Eastern Christianity has a different view. It still uses the notion of seeing God, but it has a different meaning for Western Christianity. It's certainly important in Islam, and it is an interesting question as to how this is to be taken, because it's said in ordinary language. That is, that we will see God, or we will be in the presence of God, or something of that sort, in the afterlife, or perhaps we could see God in certain ways in this life, etc. But it's in Scripture, and the linguistic mode of Scripture is not necessarily that of science and philosophy. So it does raise issues about what should be taken seriously and what should not, what has to be taken metaphorically. Now, among thinkers of the classical rationalist Arabic philosophical tradition, this was an important issue. And they followed very, very carefully Aristotle, and I'm thinking here of Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes, followed Aristotle very, very closely, and developed the notion of ultimate human happiness through their consideration of Nicomachean Ethics 10.7 and also Metaphysics 1.1, or Book 1 anyway, where that ultimate fulfillment in the metaphysics, the ultimate fulfillment is described there as knowing separate substances or knowing eternal entities of some kind. And Aristotle says in Nicomachean Ethics 10.7 that ultimate human happiness consists in some kind of intellectual activity. So these were in the tradition, in the Aristotelian and Platonic tradition, as ways of achieving fulfillment and eudaimonia, well-spiritedness, or ultimately happiness and fulfillment. In the Arabic tradition, this was taken over, and the Arabic philosophical tradition stayed separate to some extent, was separate to some extent methodologically from the religious and theological tradition, and they developed the Aristotelian notions on this, and certainly embraced this kind of Aristotelian elitism that only certain people who were able to achieve things in life, had natural ability, but also had opportunity and good teachers, etc., could ultimately attain fulfillment and happiness. This even is the case for Avicenna, for whom the soul is per se rational. The person, in fact, is the rational soul, one would say, for him, and the body is merely a tool to be used. And for Avicenna, if you don't make use of your abilities to develop knowledge in the present life, you may find yourself to be asleep in the next life. You have a per se rational soul that will not die, but those who have not developed their souls are asleep and have no idea what's going on around them and don't even know they're asleep, I suppose. So this particular presentation is prompted by problems in the Latin tradition, but also problems among colleagues in talking about Averroes, and people having new insights into Averroes and reading Averroes in different ways. And I think there's a major difficulty here and an intrusion by the Latin tradition into the proper interpretation of Averroes. But it's certain that that intrusion also involves Latin Averroism, so this makes for some interesting fun. So what I'm going to do is look at, I have a complete outline there for you, but I have to look at the Latin tradition, and I'll show you 4 texts of Aquinas where Aquinas lays out the notion that for Averroes, ultimate human happiness is to attain knowledge of separate substances. And that's the way Aquinas lays it out, and that is incorrect. So what's happening with but that is also the view of the Latin Averroes. So my thesis, in part, one of many theses in this, is that Aquinas was a strong promoter of Latin Averroism, in the sense that his interpretation of Averroes was key, was used by others, understood by others, and key to the development of Latin Averroism, which is quite interesting. And we'll look at texts from the Commentary on the Sentences, the De Veritate, Contra Gentiles, and the Commentary on the Metaphysics that all support that view. And then I'll say a few things about Saint-Germain and Latin Averroism in that regard as well toward the end. So for the most part, what I'm doing in here is I'm going to, well, this is on Averroes, and I will get to Averroes. I want to lay out this notion in Aquinas, because it's not been put forward as far as I know. David will certainly let me know if it has. Let me proceed with that then. So I'm going to proceed with what I have written for you now, starting page 2. So for Aquinas, this is Aquinas as a source on for Latin Averroism then. For Aquinas, the perfect fulfillment of a human being in ultimate happiness can only be found in the intellectual apprehension of the essence of God in the afterlife, and only by way of divine assistance. While it is something desired by all human beings, its attainment lies beyond the natural powers of human beings. Perhaps his most famous accounts of this are to be found in his Summa Contra Gentiles, where he reasons to this view on philosophical grounds, and in his Summa Theologiae, where he also reasons to it on philosophical grounds, although he does so as theologian, as befits the context of that work. I will not be concerned with this latter work, the Summa Theologiae here, by Aquinas in this presentation, but rather will restrict myself to selected texts from 4 works: the Commentary on the Sentences, the De Veritate, Summa Contra Gentiles, and the Commentary on the Metaphysics. So I start with the Commentary on the Sentences, which is early to mid-1250s. His first study of the issue is found in the Commentary on the Sentences, Book 4, Distinction 49, Question 2, where he sets forth his view of ultimate happiness as human supernatural understanding of the highest of separate substances, namely God, per essentiam, or face-to-face, by explicitly drawing on a model proposed by Alexander of Aphrodisias and Averroes, as explained by Averroes in his long commentary on the De Anima. That's the only access to Alexander that Aquinas had at the time, as far as I know. The De Intellectu of Alexander was available, but I have no evidence that Aquinas read it. The discussion in the Commentary on the Sentences takes place then, as I said, in Book 4, in Article 1, which has the title, Whether the Blessed Will See God in His Essence. While the context is clearly theological, in his response, Aquinas chooses to address the issue for the most part through consideration of the views of philosophers, and in particular through those philosophers of the Arabic tradition. So we have text there. The text 2, etc., those are a little bit off. Anyway, he says, I respond that it should be said that as, according to faith, we hold that the ultimate end of human life is the vision of God, so too the philosophers asserted that the ultimate happiness of human beings is to understand substances separate from matter in being. For this reason, the same difficulty and diversity concerning this question is found in the philosophers and in the theologians. For some philosophers asserted that our possible intellect, that is the receptive aspect of our intellect, can never reach the understanding of separate substances, as in the case of Al-Farabi at the end of his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, a work that's not extant. Although he said the contrary in his book on the intellect, his Risale fil Aql, as the commentator Averroes indicates in Book 3 of his long commentary on the De Anima. Likewise, some theologians have asserted that the human intellect can never attain the vision of God in his essence, That notion comes through an interpretation of Dionysus, the Areopagite, and the Eastern notion that God transcends all apprehension, but only God's powers are known. This was a hot issue in the generation before Aquinas. What moves both groups to this is continuing Aquinas here, what moves both groups to this view is the distance between our intellect and the divine essence, or the other separate substances. So God is among the separate substances. For although the intellect in act is in some way one with the intelligible in act, that is the noetic identity of Aristotle, it seems difficult for the created intellect to become the uncreated essence in some way. Whence also Chrysostom says, for does the created somehow see the uncreated? That's good. The greater difficulty in this is for those who assert the possible intellect to be generable and corruptible, that is our receptive personal intellects, such that it is a power dependent on the body, not only with respect to divine vision, but with respect to the vision of any separate substances. So that's a bit of a problem. He goes on, but this position can in no way stand. First, because it is contrary to the authority of canonic scripture, as Augustine says in his book on seeing God. Secondly, because understanding is an operation most fully proper to human beings, since it is necessary that its happiness be assigned to it to be in accord with this, since this operation is complete in itself, that is understanding. Since, however, the perfection of understanding, insofar as it is of this sort, is the intelligible itself, if a human being does not attain vision of the divine essence in the most perfect operation of the intellect, but attains something else, it will necessarily be said that something else other than God is what provides ultimate happiness for man himself. And since the ultimate perfection of anything is conjoining with its principle, it follows that something else other than God is the efficient principle of human beings. But that's absurd in our view, and likewise absurd among the philosophers who assert that our souls emanate from the separate substances, so that ultimately we are able to understand these separate substances. That's Aquinas, the Commentary on Sentences. After this, the response is wholly dedicated to the philosophers Ibn Bajjah, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Alexander, and Averroes. For this he draws almost exclusively on the long commentary on the De Anima by Averroes, Aquinas does, with the exception of the discussion of Avicenna, which is taken from Avicenna's Metaphysics and De Anima. Following Averroes' long commentary closely, he rejects the skepticism of Al-Farabi's lost commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, which purportedly rejects the possibility of human knowledge of separate substances, and likewise rejects with detailed argument the abstractionist reasoning of Ibn Bajjah. Avicenna's views are also rejected because they entail an intermediary between knower and the divine essence as proper object of ultimate knowing and happiness. After detailed discussion, Aquinas indicates that none of those methods are sufficiently cogent for explaining the intellectual apprehension of God and ultimate happiness. He writes that another mode should be taken, which also some philosophers have asserted, namely Alexander and Averroes, in the third book of the long commentary on the De Anima. For since in any cognition there is some necessary form by which the thing is known or seen, that form by which the intellect is brought to seeing separate substances is not the quiddity which the intellect abstracts from composed things, that is, from things of the world, as the first opinion said, nor is it some impression left by the separate substance in our intellect, as the second said. Rather, it is the separate substance itself which is conjoined to our intellect as form, so that it is what is understood here, and that by which it is understood. And that's God for him. That's how we have to understand God. God is that which enables us to see, and it is that which we see. So that's Aquinas. The method or mode to which Aquinas refers here is the notion that conjunction of the human intellect with the separate substance in such a way that the human being is raised to a higher level to be able to be receptive enough to have within it a direct knowledge of God. For Alexander, as expounded by Averroes and for Averroes himself, The separately existing agent intellect must be the active power that enters into the human intellectual soul and also actualizes the receptive material, that's Alexander's term, material intellect, bringing the three together in such a way that the human individual has abstracted knowledge in natural human knowing. For Alexander, this also involves some knowledge of separate immaterial substance, as it does for Averroes. But Alexander does not explain this with sufficient depth and precision in his works. For Averroes, however, there is a different understanding, which we'll consider shortly. And here's the text of Aquinas. And whatever is the case for other separate substances, nevertheless, we must accept that mode in the vision of God in His essence, because by whatever other form our intellect is informed, it cannot be brought through that to the divine essence. Indeed, it ought not to be understood as if the divine essence is the true form of our intellect, or that out of this and our intellect simply one thing is made. We become God then, as in natural things made from natural form and matter. Rather, it should be understood to come about because the relation of the divine essence to our intellect is as the relation of form to matter. The form can also mean actuality. We need to keep that in context. For whenever there are any two things of which one is more perfect than the other, and these are received in the same recipient, there is a relation of one of the two to the other, namely of the more perfect to the less perfect, as is the relation of form to matter. This is just as when light and color are received into the diaphanous medium, for which light is related to color as form to matter. So too, when the intellective power is received in the soul and the divine essence is indwelling in the soul, although not in the same mode, the divine essence is related to the intellect as form to matter. So it's the actualization of the ability to apprehend, and it's the actualization of what is potential. That's Aquinas. So here Aquinas draws on the text of Averroes for this description of form and matter as act or perfection and potency. But more important for present purposes, Aquinas asserts that Averroes holds for human knowing of separate substances, wherein, quote, it is the separate substance itself which is conjoined to our intellect as form, so that it is what is understood here and that by which it is understood. Aquinas does not explain how this works for Averroes, since he's primarily interested in using the model of Alexander and Averroes for his own explication of ultimate human knowing of the essence of God. However, he does say more in his De Veritate. De Veritate, a little bit later, still in Paris. In De Veritate, question 18, article 5, did Adam, in the state of innocence, see the angels through their essence? Aquinas asserts in the response that, quote, by natural knowledge man cannot attain to knowledge of the angels through their essence. This would be to know separate substances. And in the response to objection 8, he remarks, in the response to section 8, to objection 8, remarks again, drawing on the long commentary on the De Anima by Averroes, this time referring to the teachings of Themistius in the paraphrase of the De Anima, a work not available in Latin at that time, but only known through the long commentary by Averroes. Aquinas writes in his response to the objection the following: the commentator takes a third way between the opinion of Alexander and that of Themistius. For he says that the possible intellect is separated and eternal, in which he agrees with Themistius, and differs from Alexander. And nevertheless, that the objects of I don't like speculative, somebody is theoretical. The objects of theoretical understanding are temporal things and produced through the activity of the agent intellect. This is science, knowledge through abstraction. In this way, he agrees with Alexander and differs from Themistius. He says that these objects have a double existence, one by which they are one by which they are based on phantasms, and in this sense they are in us, the other by which they are in the possible intellect. Consequently, through the mediation of these intelligible objects, the possible intellect is united to us. He goes on. Now the agent, this is from the De Veritate again, now the agent is related to these intelligible things as form to matter, for since the possible intellect receives intelligibles of this type, which are grounded in phantasms, and also receives the agent intellect, and since the agent intellect is more perfect, the proportion of the agent intellect to intelligibles of this sort, which are in us, must be like the proportion of form to matter. This, and I take this sense as actualization and actuality. This is like the reciprocal proportion of light and color, which are received in the transparent, as also between all things, one of which is more perfect than the other, which are received in one thing. Therefore, when the production of such intelligibles takes place in us, then the agent intellect is united to us perfectly as form, and in this way we will be able to know separated substances through the agent intellect. That's Aquinas explaining Averroes. Just as we now are able to know through the understanding, which is in its habitual state. Thus, in the commentary on the sentences, Aquinas affirms that for Averroes, ultimate happiness is found in knowledge of separate substances with little detail provided. But here in the De Veritate, he does explain that there are two modes of understanding according to Averroes. One through natural knowing of items of the physical world, which involves abstraction brought about through the presence of the agent intellect in the soul as form, or actualizer, and another of knowing, quote, separated substances through the agent intellect. Aquinas does not explain this second kind of knowing sufficiently, but it's not unreasonable to infer that the material intellect, which is receptive, must also be involved in this conception attributed to Averroes. I note also, for reference in what follows here, that Aquinas used the plural separated substances in the quotation immediately above. So we see Aquinas setting out this doctrine that Averroes has this notion of knowing separate substances is our fulfillment. Again, in the Summa Contra Gentiles, written a bit later, Book 2 focuses on creation and deals with natural epistemology. We see in Book 2, Chapter 59, Aquinas begins his rejection of the views of Averroes. In 2, Chapter 62, Aquinas attacks the view of Alexander, of Aphrodisius. In 2, Chapter 70, he asserts his own doctrine is found in Aristotle. In 270, he also begins to set out his own view. And in 2, Chapter 74, he initiates his rejection of Avicenna's view and goes on to set out his own view of the soul. Now, Book 3, in Book 3, his concern is with providence. And providence will include the notion of human beings being brought back to God and brought back to the presence of God, and everything put in its proper order, and human beings attaining their proper end. Book 3 is really quite fascinating. It's very well structured, very nicely structured. In Summa Contra Gentiles 3, Chapter 1, he begins his treatment of providence and moves toward discussion of ultimate human happiness that can be attained by one of his creatures, namely human beings. For Aquinas, that ultimate happiness consists in seeing, that is intellectually knowing, God, who is the preeminent separate intellectual substance. He takes up this in earnest in 3, Chapter 25, entitled that to understand God is the end of every intellectual substance. In Book 3, Chapter 41, he directly takes up our topic. He says, an intellectual substance has still another kind of knowledge of God. Indeed, it has been stated in Book 2 that a separate substance, in knowing its own essence, knows both what is above and what is below itself in a manner proper to its substance. That's a paraphrase of Liber de Causas and Proclus. So Proclus is in the game here too. This is especially, he goes on, this is especially necessary if what is above it is its cause, since the likeness of the cause must be found in the effects. And I find that also in actually Book 3 of Aristotle's Physics, but that's another story. And so, I continue, since God is the cause of all created intellectual substances, as is evident from the foregoing, then separate intellectual substances, in knowing their own essence, must know God himself by way of a vision of some kind. For a thing whose likeness exists in the intellect is known through the intellect by way of vision, just as the likeness of a thing which is seen corporeally is present in the sense of the viewer. So whatever intellect understands, whatever given intellect understands as separate substance, by knowing what it is, sees God in a higher way than he is known by any of the previously treated types of knowledge. Hence, since some men have claimed that man's ultimate end is in this life, because they know separate substances, we must consider whether man can know separate substances in this life. It's important to note, he says in this life, because Aquinas himself rejects this idea of seeing God in this life and living, that kind of thing. But he's pretty careful with the scriptural texts on that. But it also has implications for the Latin Averroists later. So in the following chapter, in 342, yes, 3, chapter 42, he outlines the position of Alexander of Aphrodisias, again, as reported in the long commentary on the Dionymum of Averroes, because that's his only access to it, and summarizes as follows. Now, so this is on Alexander. Now, since according to his opinion, the possible intellect cannot understand separate substances, as has already been said, he thought that we will understand separate substances through the habitual understanding. Now, the term habitual understanding is intellectus in habitu here. So this is for Averroes, the intellectus in habitu is the disposed intellect, and this is the intellect that has the theoretical intelligibles. So we have knowledge. This knowledge is in the understanding. He thought that we will understand separate substances through the habitual intellect, insofar as the agent intellect, which he supposes to be a separate substance, becomes the form of the habitual understanding and a form for us ourselves. Thus, we will understand through it. Well, the sense here then is the agent intellect helps us understand, helps us do intellectual abstraction and have understanding. But there's more to it. Thus, we will understand through it, as we now understand through the possible intellect. Now, so we understand the possible intellect is the intellect in us. So we understand things in ourselves, but we can know through the agent intellect somehow. Okay, let's go on. And since it is the function of the power of the agent intellect to make all things which are potentially intelligible to be actually understood, and to understand separate substance, and to understand the separate substances, we will understand separate substances in this life, and also all non-separate intelligible things. So there's two kinds of knowledge going on here. One is through abstraction, intellectual abstraction, which is another topic we get into, perhaps. And the other is somehow through having the agent intellect in us. And as we'll see, the idea is that when the agent intellect is in us, we can see all that it sees. And as an intellect, it sees other things, and it can even see God and so forth. This is in Avicenna, where the notion. This is also in Avicenna, where the notion is that the rational soul, which is per se eternal, the rational soul, when we die, goes back. It goes back toward the active intellect. But if it didn't develop itself, then it can't share in the active intellect's understanding of the divine, because the active intellect contemplates God. Now, sometimes in the religious language of Avicenna, it can be said that, well, we will see God. But for Avicenna, we'll see God through the agent intellect, because we don't have the ability to directly see it. We're not intellects per se in the fullest sense. So I just did that. Okay. We are in ourselves. This is Alexander. We are in ourselves. I'm paraphrasing that. In ourselves, perishable material intellects, where material means receptive again. But through the agent intellect, we can come to have intellectual knowledge as intellectus in habitu in the theoretical sciences. We can grasp, we can do abstraction, we can grasp the first premises for the demonstrations that we will put together by means of which we will put together science. But we need, as Aristotle indicated, we need some kind of access to the world in this, and as you know, as I'm sure you all know, in Posture Analytics 219, he puts something forward here. Something's going on, and it's not just the enumeration of individuals. And he explains it all with that phrase, the soul is so constituted as to do this. And Aristotle tells us everything right there, or nothing, I guess. We'd like to know how that works. Okay, well, but my point is here then that this is the theoretical sciences, so that help develop us in this way. And this is, and Ibn Bajjah refers to this as well, the development of the theoretical sciences, and then it can turn into somehow grabbing the agent intellect. And Averroes is thinking about that, but he doesn't think that's right. Okay, this can lead to knowledge of separate substances, one kind of knowledge. Another of his views is that the acquired intellect disposes us for a further step in attaining ultimate perfection and happiness. In this, there are two kinds of knowledge then. One where through the sciences and human reason, knowledge is made possible by the agent intellect, and we can reason to further to knowing separate substances as through a theoretical science. And another is that all that is preparation for a higher understanding that will take place through a uniting with the agent intellect and a knowing of what it knows of higher substances. That is, we will understand other separate substances and even God through the agent intellect. It's Avicenna in a sense, but let me leave this for the present and move on to Aquinas on Averroes. So, in Summa Contra Gentiles 3, chapter 43, Aquinas analyzes the thought of Averroes on ultimate happiness. The discussion of Aquinas is solely based on Long Commentary on the De Anima by Averroes. According to Aquinas, for Averroes, study of the theoretical sciences employing empirical experience takes place through intellectual abstraction, whereby sensory experiences of things form images in the human being. These images in the cogitative power are prepared and placed into memory. These images are then available to be intellectualized and departicularized by the agent intellect, which at the same time impresses these non-particular and immaterial intelligibles onto the receptive material intellect. He understands Averroes to hold that we share in these separate intellects, which Averroes does hold, and in that way we share in the process of abstraction by the agent intellect, and we share in the product existing in the material intellect. That is, we share the intelligibles and act in the material intellect. Through this sharing of the separate intellects, we are intellectual knowers. Now, Aquinas had objected strenuously to this doctrine in Book 2 as natural epistemology, but that's not our concern here. Now, here in the Contra Gentiles, then, he writes the following. When the objects of theoretical understanding are united with us through the phantasms, which are in a sense in their subject, the agent intellect must also be connected with us, because it is the form of the objects of theoretical understanding. I take that as the actualizing form. Thus, not the content. Content comes from sense experience. Thus, when the objects of theoretical understanding are only potentially present in us, the agent intellect is only potentially connected with us. But when the objects of theoretical understanding are united with us through the phantasms, which are in a sense their subject, the agent intellect must also be connected with us, because it is the actualizing form of the objects of theoretical understanding. Thus, when the objects of theoretical understanding are only potentially present in us, the agent intellect is only potentially connected with us. That's a that's a paraphrase of Averroes. That's why it's a bit awkward why he's phrasing it this way. He's got it right on his desk. He's just copying it out, paraphrasing it out. But when some objects of theoretical understanding are actually in us, and some are potentially present, its connection with us is partly actual and partly potential. Then it is that we are said to be in motion toward the aforementioned connection. For as more things are made to be actually understood within us, the agent intellect becomes more perfectly connected with us. We access it more and more and more and more and more. This progress and movement toward the connection is accomplished through study in the theoretical sciences, through which we acquire true objects of understanding and also false opinions that are outside the orderly process of this movement are excluded, just as monstrosities are outside the order of natural operation. Hence, men may help each other in making this progress, as they are of mutual assistance in the speculative sciences. And that's a paraphrase of Averroes. We can help each other with regard to science by studying science together. Averroes says that. Okay, the key for Aquinas in this account by Averroes is that the agent intellect comes to be formed for us as an actualizing principle, and we are united with it as such. This is according to Aquinas. That unity with the agent intellect, according to Aquinas' interpretation, enables us not only to have abstractive knowledge based on human exterior and interior senses and our own willful, intentional pursuit of knowledge, but the unity also allows us access to the knowledge of the agent intellect itself has of things above it. Aquinas then adds, quote, and so, when all potential objects of understanding have been made actual within us, the agent intellect is perfectly united with us as a form, as an actuality. And then, because we are the potentiality, and then we will understand perfectly through it, just as we now understand perfectly through the habitual intellect, that is, through the sciences and abstractions that we have already made from things in the physical world. Hence, since it is the function of the agent intellect to understand separate substances, says Aquinas about Averroes, we will then understand separate substances as we now understand the objects of speculative understanding. And this will be the ultimate felicity of man, in which man will be like some sort of God. And then he's quoting Averroes, who's quoting Themistius on that. Okay. Thus, it is clear that according to Aquinas, in the works discussed up to this point, Aquinas understands Averroes to hold that ultimate human fulfillment consists in knowing separate substances, including God, through the agent intellect. Well, let's add a little more. The commentary on the Metaphysics, which is a later work. In his 2001 article, Die Adler und die Natur, Thomas und Albert, über die Möglichkeit der Metaphysik, Carl Steele takes up the issue of the interpretation of Aristotle Metaphysics, Book 2, Chapter 1, Alpha Elaton, which came up in some discussions before. Or more precisely, the fierce attack by Aquinas on what he understands to be the interpretation of Averroes. So I'm accessing this to show how Aquinas read Averroes. This is what I'm really doing here then, right? So the text of concern is only part of the first chapter. Now Aristotle writes this, to remind you, the investigation of truth is in one way hard, in another easy. An indication of this is found in the fact that no one is able to attain truth adequately, while on the other hand, no one fails entirely. But everyone says something true about the nature of things, and while individually they contribute little or nothing to the truth, by the union of all, a considerable amount is amassed. Therefore, since the truth seems to be like the proverbial door, which no one can fail to hit, in this way it's easy. But the fact that we can have a whole truth and not the particular part we aim at shows the difficulty of it. Perhaps as difficulties are of two kinds, the cause of the present difficulty is not in the facts, but in us. For as the eyes of bats are to the blaze of the day, so is reason in our soul to the things which are by nature most evident of all. Okay. Aquinas, now this is a very mature Aquinas now, commenting just a few years before his death. Aquinas interprets this in accord with his own understanding that human beings must attain knowledge through the senses, since it is the lowest of the separate intellectual substances that need senses, but can be intellectual. As such, it cannot attain to knowing the essences of separate substances in God by natural powers. He writes the following: since the human soul occupies the lowest place in the order of intellective substances, it has the least intellective power. As a matter of fact, just as it is by nature the actuality of a body, although its intellectual power is not the act of a bodily organ, in a similar way it has a natural capacity to know the truth about corporeal and sensible things. These are less knowable by nature because of their materiality, although they can be known by abstracting sensible forms from phantasms. And since this process of knowing truth befits the nature of the human soul, insofar as it is the form of this kind of body, and whatever is natural always remains so, it is possible for the human soul, which is united to this kind of body, to know the truth about things only insofar as it can be elevated to the level of the things which it understands by abstracting from phantasms. Now, let me throw this in lest I just presume it for you. We can argue, we can make quia arguments and that sort of thing about the existence of higher things. It's just that we can't know them in an essential way in this fashion. So what we can do, if we have the abstraction, we can build up from the knowledge we have now of things to higher and higher things, but that's natural knowing. So by abstracting sensible forms from phantasm. And since this process of knowing truth befits the nature of the human soul insofar as it is formed of this kind of body, I did read that, didn't I? I better keep going. And whatever is natural always remains so, it is possible for the human soul, which is united to this kind of body, to know the truth about things only insofar as it can be elevated to the level of things which it understands by abstracting phantasms, from phantasm. However, by this process it cannot be elevated to the level of knowing the quiddities of immaterial substances, because these are not on the same level as sensible substances. Therefore, it is impossible for the human soul, which is united to this kind of body, to apprehend separate substances by knowing their quiddities. Aquinas. Were human beings naturally able to know separate substances by somehow knowing their essences, it would be possible for them to rise up to the knowledge of God. Although God is the most intelligent and intelligible entity, God transcends human intellectual apprehension for Aquinas. For him, the vision of God and God's essence cannot be had through natural human powers. Rather, as I think I mentioned already, humans in heaven must be raised up with enhanced powers of intellectual reception by God, and only then can the very essence of God be known as immediately present for human knowing, though even then in a finite way and not as God comprehends his own essence. So Aquinas writes then, for this reason, the statement of Averroes makes at this point in his commentary is evidently false. That is, that the philosopher does not prove here that it is just as impossible for us to understand abstract substances as it is for a bat to see the sun. I'm thinking of the discussion of abstract and separate that we had yesterday, too, and the difficulty in that. The argument that he gives is wholly ridiculous, for he adds that, if this were the case, nature would have acted in vain, because it would have made something that is naturally knowable in itself to be incapable of being known by anything else. And it would be the same as if it had made the sun incapable of being seen. This argument is not satisfactory for two reasons, writes Aquinas. First, the end of the separate substances does not consist in being understood by our intellect, but rather the converse. Therefore, if separate substances are not known by us, it does not follow that they exist in vain. For only that exists in vain which fails to attain the end for which it exists. Second, even though the quiddities of separate substances are not understood by us, they are understood by other intellects. The same is true of the sun. Even though it is not seen by the eye of the owl, it's seen by the eye of the eagle. Now, the text of Averroes that Aquinas is focusing on has this. This is the text of Averroes. Aristotle, and since the difficulty is of two sorts, etc. So that's how he references the text. And then he says, that is, and since the difficulty of the comprehension of beings is of two sorts, it's right that the difficulty in regard to things which are ultimate in truth, namely in the first principle and in the principles separate from matter, is on our part and not on their part. Since because they are separate, they are intelligible in themselves naturally, and not intelligible because we make them to be intelligible. We don't abstract them. But because they are in themselves intelligible, they are not like material forms. For the difficulty in regard to those is from themselves more than in us. And in virtue of that, he indicated that we will make material forms to be intelligible. The problem is they're so scrambled up with matter that we have to work to get them to separate off the forms and make them intelligible. And but that's not the case with regard to separate substances. And because the disposition of the intellect concerning an intelligible thing is like the disposition of sense regarding the sensible thing, he likens the truth of the intellect in comprehending separate things to the weakness of things which sense by sight, namely the bat, inasmuch as it is unable to comprehend what is maximally sensible, namely the sun. But this does not demonstrate that separate things are impossible for us to understand, as the seeing of the sun is impossible for the bat. Because if that were so, nature would have done something in vain, because it made what is in itself naturally an object of knowledge, at some time not understood by something, as if it would have made the sun not comprehended by some vision. All right, so that's what Averroes is really talking about there. It's questionable as to whether Aquinas understands exactly what's going on, but my point is that he again here attributes ultimate human perfection and fulfillment for Averroes to knowing separate substances and some kind of special knowing of them in some fashion. So in sum, for Aquinas, Averroes did teach the ultimate fulfillment, human fulfillment, consisted in knowing separate substances through natural human powers. Now, I'm not making a lot of progress on this great plan here. I think this, I have not been able to figure out whether this is a Twetten-like massive article of 100 pages, or it flip into a monograph on Averroes and Averroes, and I have no idea what this is going to end up as. But Siger Brabant, then, the real Latin Averroes, on ultimate happiness. 3 writings by Professor Carlos Steele relevant to this issue are his 2001 Siger Brabant versus Thomas Aquinas on the possibility of knowing separate substances, and his plenary lecture at Erfurt in 1998, Medieval Philosophy and Impossible Project, Thomas Aquinas and the Averroistic Ideal of Happiness, and the article I already mentioned. For the issue at stake here, I focus just on part of the first of these, though all are relevant. In his Thomas Aquinas versus Siger Brabant, Steele begins by noting that medieval thinkers connected the issues of ultimate human happiness and knowing separate substances with the discussion of the limits of human knowing provided by Aristotle here, right? And Book 2 of the Metaphysics, and the issue of the bat's ability to see the brightness of day, as analogous to human understanding of highest causes. For Aquinas, knowledge of the highest cause of all is the end which constitutes ultimate human fulfillment and happiness, but it is only possible thanks to divine assistance, since it transcends natural human powers. Averroes, in contrast, reasons that knowing of separate substances, while very difficult, is still possible by natural human means. Now, the quotation I had from Averroes, I think he does think it's possible to know things about God, Averroes himself, but you're going to know things about God through physics, and the implications of what we know in physics as they come up in metaphysics. Okay, for his discussion, so the point is that Aquinas has to say, no, you can't possibly know the essence of the first cause. And I think Averroes is saying you can get pretty far. But Aquinas has to say absolutely not, because even with all of your human powers together, you still can't reach the end of human beings without divine assistance, divine transformation of our powers into something stronger. But for Averroes, well, yes, you can reason to all kinds of things, if you can reason to the separate existence of separate forms as intellects. Well, by analogy and study of psychology, you can reason that, in fact, they have receptivity and other things as well, like the material intellect. And you can do a lot more with it. But Aquinas is not happy about this because it seems for him to imply that you can see God. And that's one of the things that the Latin Averroists were up to. So for his discussion, Steele chooses to make use of the works of Nifo to reconstruct the reasoning of Sager's lost treatise De Intellectum. He does so by drawing on Nifo's summary of the De Anime Beatitudine and his own De Intellectum. There Steele finds Sager writing, "If the material intellect cannot have intellectual understanding of higher intellects, those higher intellects cannot themselves have intellectual understanding of God." See where we're going now. The reasoning is based on two propositions Sager is able to draw on for his interpretation from the commentary on the De Anima by Averroes. Number one, the lower intellects in the hierarchy of immaterial entities in some way have understanding of the higher, according to Averroes, and are accordingly ranked in a series in virtue of their receptivity for and actuality of intellectual understanding. That's also in his commentary on the metaphysics. And two, the lowest of these, the material intellect, is the most receptive of all the collection of separate intellects. Now, to abbreviate and to make the point with more precision, if this is the case, then all separate intellects have some vision of the receptivity found in the material intellect, which is the most receptive of all things. As the most receptive of all things, the material intellect has receptivity to apprehend separate substances, and even God. But if the material intellect has that, so too do the other members of the genus of immaterial intellects have it in a hierarchy of actualities reaching toward God. On this account, then, ultimate human happiness is to be found in human conjunction with the material and agent intellects, in virtue of which human beings are able to come to know God. Such an endeavor starts with the intellectual abstraction by which scientific knowledge of the world is gained, and through which human beings are joined with the material intellect through the abstractive power of the agent intellect. The special nature of the material intellect as most receptive of all intellects, however, means that much more than intellectual abstraction is open to human beings, more than the content of the items of the earthly realm and the realm of the physical heavens. Science in this way opens human beings to a way in which natural human knowing leads to ultimate happiness in knowing God. Again, thanks to the receptivity of the material intellect. This is Sager-Brabant. To be clear, on this account, the knowledge of the immaterial intellects and of God, which constitutes ultimate human happiness, does not come about through discursive argument and causal reasoning from human observation of the nature of motion, but rather from the analysis of human knowing that found the shared material intellect as the route to happiness. Now, what's going on? So the Latin tradition has it, Aquinas says it's the agent intellect, Sager says it's the material intellect. Either way, the Latin tradition has it that for Averroes, the ultimate human fulfillment is to be found in knowing, apprehending, having the essence of separate intellects. And human beings can get that by connecting up with the material intellect and the agent intellect and rising higher and higher. And this is not in Averroes. So I was going to talk a bit, as you see, to fill out this discussion of Averroes, so I've got part of the outline there for you. I'd have to talk about how to read his texts. I've written about that elsewhere, but I have to say something in this because people don't understand that, and it's essential. So with regard to matters, method in matters of religion and philosophy, the texts need to be divided because they're understood in different ways. Religious texts and dialectical texts are written in the context of of traditional religious belief. One dialectical text is incoherence of the incoherence, because it's all written in the context of the God of the Quran. Well, some modifications are made, but it's written in the context of that, and the context of common religious views. Other works do the same kind of thing. So, in philosophy, however, he does not address the materials the same way. In philosophy, he's only concerned with the reasoning. Now, in the long commentary on the De Anima, for instance, there's no discussion of prophecy. Yet all the other major philosophers, when they talk about psychology, talk about prophecy. There's no prophecy there. There's no role for prophecy to be played. And he does it also in other ways as well. So he keeps the two of them distinct, because philosophy is after the truth in itself. Philosophy and the sciences are after truth in itself, and the dialectical reasoning is there for those who are not able to apprehend the truth in its fullness, which is in the science of metaphysics and in the theoretical sciences. And he keeps his discourse separate for the most part, although he slips it occasionally. So with regard to Averroes then on the afterlife and the human soul, in the dialectical works of the Fasl Maqal, that is a so-called decisive treatise, which is not a decisive treatise, it's a treatise on the distinction of discourses. The discourses are religious, dialectical discourse, and philosophical scientific discourse. And the Kashf al-Manahij, which is the analysis of the kinds of argumentation used in religious doctrines, in the formation of religious doctrines. It's a critical analysis of kalam arguments. And the foundation of it is very, very Aristotelian, but he analyzes all of these. These are dialectical arguments. And in the Kashf al-Manahij, he says that this treatise is dhahir. It's for the external, and it's not the interpreted. It's not the interpreted text. The interpreted text would be interpreted by experts and scholars. He said, "I'm not doing that. That's another kind of discourse." And he refers back to the Fasl Maqal as that. Now, so he asserts that he holds a standard doctrine that there's going to be a continued existence, an afterlife, that sort of thing. And then he slips in the Kashf al-Manahij, he slips in this other thing, and he says, sometimes he just can't help being a philosopher. Sometimes statements are not understood, not about what people think they're about, put it that way. And such is the doctrine of the afterlife. Now the purpose, and he goes on and he slips this in, it's slightly interpreted, but it's there. The purpose of the doctrine of the afterlife is not the afterlife. The purpose of the doctrine of the afterlife is to help people form themselves as good moral persons. Because there is no afterlife. But he can't help it. He doesn't say there's no afterlife. He can't. That's a philosophical issue. He can't do that in the religious context. But he can't help but slip in that the purpose of the doctrine of the afterlife is not the afterlife. Which is, it's just he can't control himself from being a philosopher in this. And I was really shocked when I saw that and saw the context. Okay, so what about personal immortality in the metaphysics, long commentary on metaphysics, and long commentary on the De Anima. And now we get into the texts that I know I'm taking a long time, but I hope this is as interesting for you as it is for me. It's going to get more interesting. I'm moving along. Okay, so Averroes. Averroes and Aquinas are in agreement that ultimate human happiness is to be found through the intellect and its fulfillment. Now, forgive me if I abbreviate again, but I've shown articles published in 1998 and 2012 that for Averroes, on his philosophical accounts, there is no personal or impersonal afterlife for particular human beings. Sometimes if someone says there's no personal afterlife, then people get this idea that there's one soul that we all go back to or something like that. And no, there's just no afterlife. I've also shown that in another article published in 2012 that for Averroes the highest kind of worship of God is to be found in the science of metaphysics, which investigates the nature of the Creator and His creation. And it's termed iktira, not ibda. Ibdat is a creation ex nihilo. He rejects that, to use the terminology of Averroes himself. The implication here is that while ordinary acts of religious study and worship are suitable for lesser thinkers, for the philosopher there is a very different approach to be used, one that employs the theoretical sciences, and particularly that of metaphysics, in which God is known as the first cause and primary instance of being qua being, which knows nothing outside of himself, knowing solely himself. But we can't get to God. This is back to David's paper as well. We can't get to this except through physics. Once we have physics settled, then we can get into the issue of metaphysics. Now, the knowledge of God and of separate substances for Averroes that comes about in metaphysics is not some sort of intuitive knowledge for Averroes. So there arises the question of just what sort of knowledge is involved. As is well known, Averroes finds the proof of God in the science of physics and the study of motion of sublunar things by consideration of the requisite causes of observable motion, in this following Aristotle to a considerable extent. For Averroes, as for Aquinas, human knowledge begins in the senses in apprehension of the empirical world. In fact, Aquinas gets it from Averroes. Sense perception, and that's starting to be acknowledged now. Therese Corey has a nice article in the Journal of the History of Philosophy, and happens to mention this in passing. It's from Aquinas gets most of this from Averroes. So, sense perception provides its experienced actualities to common sense, which in turn forms an image placed in imagination. The cogitative power works to purify the images and denude them of what is extraneous, though those images are still particulars, places those images into memory. At that stage of the process, the agent intellect and material intellect come to be ente suke, it's what Aristotle has, and they come to be phinafs, in the soul, in a way that is neither accidental nor wholly ontological or substantial. The agent intellect comes to be what he calls form for us, the terms are from Alexander, and at our willing abstracts. So we control these separate intellects. Abstracts the intelligible in act from the contents of memory, and in the same stroke it impresses it into the material intellect as an immaterial intelligible in act. And here Averroes writes, quote, "The agent intelligence understands nothing of the things which are here in the world," close quote, and relegates it to the status of a principle and a fully active intellect with no receptivity in its own right. This is a little bit of a problem for this discussion of the receptivity of the material intellect, or the receptivity of the agent intellect in knowing higher substances or something. For Averroes, the positing of these two separate substances as principles of human knowing is done in order to provide a coherent account of the phenomenon of human experience of particulars and intellectual knowledge of intelligibles in act, commonly, albeit not altogether correctly, called universals. To the extent that in his account of natural knowledge, Averroes can infer the need for these two principles, the agent intellect and the material intellect, to that extent these can be known to be present and operative in human understanding. However, there is no account of another way of knowing apparent to me in my studies of his works. There, just through the intellectual abstraction and the formation of science, and the theoretical sciences. There are, however, two passages in the long commentary on the De Anima that are worth considering. The first is Book 3, Comment 36, where on Crawford's page 464, where he writes regarding Aristotle, "But when one considers all the accounts by that man," namely Aristotle, "and brings them together, one will see that he holds that when the intellect which is in potency is actualized, then the agent intelligence will be united with us, and it is in virtue of this that we understand separate things, and in virtue of this that we make sensible things intelligible in act, insofar as it becomes form for us." My point is that this is not separate entities. These are the separate things, are the things abstracted, insofar as it becomes form for us. It is as if he means by this account that when the intellect which is in potency is actualized and perfected, then that intellect, the agent intellect, will be united with the material intellect, and the form will come to be in the material intellect. See, the rest of this passage is about intellectual abstraction. He's not talking about knowing separate entities here, but the terminology is confusing. It is as if he means by this account that when the intellect which is in potency is actualized and perfected, then that intellect, the agent intellect, will be united with the material intellect, and the form will come to be in the material intellect. Then we will understand other things in virtue of that agent intellect. This is not in such a way that the material intellect understands the agent intellect, and on that account of that understanding there comes to exist a conjoining with that intellect. What's he saying? It's not as if all the intelligibles are in the agent intellect and the material intellect gets them directly from the agent intellect. No, it's got to get them by abstraction. Otherwise it would be Avicennian, quasi-Avicennian doctrine, or Platonic. But rather, the conjoining of that intellect, the agent intellect, with us is the cause of the fact that the material intellect understands the agent intellect. So it comes into connection with it because we are trying to do the intellectual understanding. And we understand other separate things through the agent intellect. Okay? We make further abstractions through the agent intellect. This is the text that's misinterpreted. In context, I understand this to be an explanation of human intellectual understanding through the process of abstraction described above, by which the agent intellect is united with the material intellect and the intelligible in act is impressed upon the material intellect. This is abstractive knowledge based on human sensory experience and the powers of the brain. The separate things mentioned here are the intelligibles in act, which have been extracted by the agent intellect from the images in human memory. Another suggestive passage is found in the same comment, where he writes, quote, "But for us who have asserted that the material intellect is eternal, and the theoretical intelligibles are generable and corruptible in the way in which we have mentioned, and that the material intellect understands both, namely the material forms and the separate forms, it is evident that the subject of the theoretical intelligibles and of the agent intellect in this way is one and the same, namely the material intellect. Similar to this is the transparent, which receives color and light at one and the same time, and light is what brings color about." So this is all about intellectual abstraction. And the separate substances don't have to be abstracted from matter. Still in context, there is no related discussion of knowing separate substances as entities, immaterial entities. Hence, I do not understand the reference the separate forms to be a reference to separate substances. Rather, it seems to be a reference to intelligibles in act extracted by the agent intellect from the images in the human memory. Allow me to mention one more text, this one from the Commentary on the Metaphysics at Book Lambda. There he says something quite different from what he says in the Commentary on the De Anima. He writes in this passage, it's at 1490, that if the material intellect reaches the point of being denuded of all potentiality that it had when it functioned as a principle of human scientific knowledge, then there would be no more need of agent intellect. What's he got in mind? He's got De Anima 3:4 in mind, right? Where Aristotle says when the man of science has attained all the intelligibles, he no longer needs sense perception. And that's interpreted in various ways. In that case, quote, "Either we are in this state not intellecting at all by this intellect, or it is impossible that we should ever be not intellecting by it, but it remains that when this intellect is free from potentiality, we are intellecting it in the sense that its act is its substance, and this is highest bliss." I take this to be a hypothetical and hyperbolic account of what would happen if there were ever an end to the eternal world. In sum, though Averroes does speak at least once of material intellect as what is receptive of all material forms, and of being the most receptive of all things, he by no means spells out any doctrine in his psychology or metaphysics whereby, through the material intellect or agent intellect, other higher substances and even God is known. So my conclusion is that Averroes does not hold the doctrine the Latins attribute to him, the Latins misread the text. I need to still do some more work to find out the initial source of the misreading of the texts. But the first and second of Averroism issue also is a misreading of the text of Averroes, had a big impact on people as well. So that's what I'm up to, but I think this is a much more hearty topic. And I mean, I think it really is toward one of your 100-page papers, David, to really get into. But thanks a lot for your patience in this. I have taken fully, even with the time we waited for David or something, I've taken more than an hour. And I'm sorry. No, I'm not really sorry, but I understand. Thank you for your patience.
He's got that, I'm late, and now it's permanent on YouTube forever. I'm late. No, I apologize.